Good morning, family. So I was asked to talk about humility today, as you guys can see. Let me actually remember to turn this on today. There we go. All right. So I was asked to talk about humility today. Kind of came from our men's Bible study that we had last Saturday, and some of the conversations we had at that time. So today we're specifically going to be looking at the effects humility has on the people around us, and hopefully why that makes it even more important. So first, for the first verse today, we're going to look at Philippians chapter 2. And in verse 3, it says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your interest, but each of you to the interest of others." So I want to point out a mistake that I've made a couple times in conversation. I realized that as I was working on this lesson, is that I've misspoken a few times, and for some reason kept giving the definition of honor in place of the definition of glory. And that may seem like a weird mistake to make, but honor, the original definition for honor means to give weight to something. The definition to glorify, to give glory to something, means to bring light to something. So I realized as I was going through this that there's been several conversations where I somehow got the two definitions mixed up. So I apologize to those people who I told that to. But the idea of humbling ourselves, or to being a humble person, practicing humility, depending on what version of the word you're looking at, it means to make oneself less than, right? It is the idea, if we look at glorifying, is to bring light to something, then to humble something or to humiliate, which is where that word comes from, it means to take light off of something. Now here's the problem. The reason humiliate has such a negative connotation is because we don't use the word humiliate unless we're talking about influencing someone else. And while we're called to be humble, we are not called to humiliate others. Does that make sense? So I want you to think of when we talk about glory, I want you to think of, I'm trying to think of a non-nerdy way of referencing something here. A spotlight, right? The old mechanical, manually operated spotlight, right? It's big, you got two handles on each side, and they would have a person that had to man that spotlight. Right? The idea of being humble and glorifying something else means shining that spotlight on other things and recognizing that as the man behind the spotlight, you are not going to be seen. The man operating the spotlight would not be doing his job if he ended up in front of the spotlight. Right? So, this is essentially what arrogance and pride is. It's another way of saying to glorify oneself. All eyes on me, right? But likewise, it is up to each person to come to a place of humility. It is not our place to forcibly take light off of someone else. In fact, the idea of humbling oneself really involves shining the light on other people. So, as euphemisms go, as examples go, I think it's a good analogy, but analogies can only take you so far. So, there's some struggles that come with being humble and learning where some of those lines are, right? Because how do I become humble? How can I be humble without becoming something everyone can walk on. That could be a really hard line to find at times. The response that I came to after a time is that if I am primarily concerned with other people walking on me, then I have already failed at humility. Being humble means giving the benefit of the doubt. It's what allows us to not assume the worst of people's intention. It's being humble and making other people more important than ourselves. It means that when somebody does something that I find to be wrong, I can come at the situation from a perspective of a mistake has been made or an error of judgment, rather than placing condemnation and judgment on the person's intention. Because to assume that you know why somebody is doing something is in fact a practice in arrogance. It shows that you have a worldview that everyone is just like you, has all the same experiences you do, and will react to the same stimuli in the same way that you would. It also suggests that you believe that you are right in how you respond. It assumes that you think the way you would react to something is always the correct way. We observe the world as humans through our limited perspective. We observe the world through a lens of comparison. Okay? Everything we see, everything we observe by comparison. Okay? So I want you to think of it this way. Anytime we observe motion, right, whether it's a thing or a person, anytime we observe something moving, we can only know that that's moving by comparing it to something else. Our minds cannot actually witness motion without something stable to compare the motion to. This is basic psychology and biology. We are incapable of doing this. If I put a video of a tire spinning on a black background, how would you know that that tire is spinning? Well, if you can see writing on the tire, you would know because the words are in a different position. But how do you know that it's not just the words moving? Well, because we're smart people, at least semi-smart, right? The words on tires don't move by themselves. But the fact is, you only know that there's motion by comparing where the words used to be to where they are now. If the tire has rims, you know that there's motion because you can observe that the position of the spokes in the rim is actually different than it was prior. If you take it off of a black background, your mind is going to process movement by the fact that it is a changing scene behind it. Every single thing we observe in the world is observed through comparison. How do we observe people? By comparison. When we assess somebody's worth, when we assess somebody's character, when we assess somebody's intelligence, when we assess somebody's physical strength, anything we assess about a person is done through comparison. Now, the only control we actually really have is to decide what our point of standard is, our baseline, so to speak. What are you going to compare everything to? So, I can assess everyone using myself as a baseline, which is how the vast majority of humanity does things, right? And I look at this person, well, they're not as good looking as I am, so that tells me that they're ugly because I'm better looking than them. That person isn't as smart as I am, so that's an He's an idiot because he's not as smart as I am. Right? And what is that? That is essentially a place of arrogance. You have lifted yourself up and made yourself the standard by which everything in your world is judged according to. We do this all the time without ever realizing it, how big of a problem it can become. So, to be humble, to humiliate oneself, we are essentially talking about removing ourselves from that baseline standard of recognizing that we ourselves are not the standard by which others are judged. So, to glorify oneself is essentially putting them up to that standard. All right, so when we glorify God, right, the word means to shine light on. I want you to think back to that spotlight, that you're actually swiveling it and shining that light on God. In another way of thinking about this, it is essentially a way of saying that I am making God that standard by which other things are assessed. Okay? So we use the word very frivolously. We rarely ever actually stop and think about what it means to glorify God. And oftentimes we claim we're glorifying God when we're really not. When we sing worship, sing songs of praise, does that glorify God? We usually define it as such. But let me ask you something. What's the standard which you're judging worship? Yeah, but what are you comparing it to? Wow, that song leader is not nearly as good as the one we had last week. I wouldn't sing that song like that. He's leading it too high, went way too low. He's too fast. He's too slow. He's off pitch. He sings the same songs every time he leads. What's the comparison? That most of those statements would show yourself. It's essentially insinuating the idea, it's not what I would do. Or, I could do better. But you see, by making those statements, you are actually self-glorifying. The very opposite of humility. I want you to think of glorify and humility, and I made a point to make two sides of this because I think sometimes we don't realize that they really are meant to be polar opposite ideas. But I want you to think about this. If I were, let me see, somebody, yeah. If I were to have Eden come up and sit on this table back here. Now this table is much higher than her natural sitting position, right? So how would she get up here? What is the process that she would use? Well, she would go up, and she would use her hands, and she would push down. I hope that some of you already see the significance of what I just said. In order to lift herself up to another height, her only option as a limited human being is to push down on something. Likewise, to make oneself lower, you have no choice as a limited human being than to lift up on something. Obviously subtracting gravity from the equation, right? So, to humble oneself, it means to make oneself lower, less than, take the light off of, and we do that by lifting up on everyone else. And that prevents us from allowing ourselves to be that standard. When everyone else is lifted up to our level or higher, we are no longer able to make ourselves the standard by which they're judged. But so often we all seek to elevate our positions. We seek to elevate our positions in the church. We seek to elevate our positions in social circles. We seek to elevate our positions in employment. But whenever we seek to elevate our position, to forcibly elevate our position, We as limited human beings can only do so by pushing down on something. So the question that we need to be asking ourselves is, what are we pushing down on? Because more often than not, especially when we're talking about self-glorification, pride, and arrogance, more often than not, it's a person. I want you to think about what a person goes through when they experience that force. What do you think it does to a person spiritually and emotionally and mentally if you are constantly scrabbling to get higher up on that ladder and you keep pushing down on that person, and everyone else who wants to get up on that ladder is pushing down on that person? What choices do they have? What hope do they have of climbing that ladder? But instead, they're in a position where they're being brought lower and lower and lower, while everyone else is up higher and higher and higher. Now, here's the thing. We understand that that is not a great place for a person to be. Right? I hope that you can all understand what kind of hopeless position that would put somebody in. But I want you to think about this. Dave read us a scripture this morning where it mentions the term, it mentions God glorifying us. You guys remember that? Do you have the ability to go back to that slide for us? Yeah. I've got it. I actually have it right here on my front page, but it'll be easier if you guys see it too. So, in verse 4, it says, "Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." And this isn't the verse I'm looking for, but that's still the same idea here. We're looking for 1 Peter chapter 5. There you go. All right, so, yeah. "Therefore, humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you at the proper time." And if you're not aware, exalt is actually a synonym of glory. To exalt something is actually the exact same as to glorify something. And most people don't ever realize this or don't ever think about this. The Bible actually tells us that God will glorify us. Now here's something to think about, because we usually assess glory as a specific word to God. But we make the mistake of thinking that the attachment of that word is on the receiving end. We think that the way the word relates to God is that it belongs to Him. That all glory is supposed to go to God. But if you take the Bible in its entirety, the image that starts to come forth is actually that God is the originating point, not the end point. Glory does not come from you, it comes from God. Matter of fact, the only reason you can even glorify God is because He's glorified you. Because when we take glory and humility into account, side by side, we realize that that is exactly what God was doing when Jesus humbled Himself. When Jesus humbled Himself and made Himself man, He essentially lifted up. And He brought Himself down to our level. And in doing so, glorified us at the same time. He made us the most important thing in creation. So, the reason I bring up perspective, comparison, is because there's a few things that I think allow us to assess our own humility and pride. And I want to take a moment to give a little note here. And I say this on occasion for certain sermons. If you're somebody right now that in your head is going, "Oh, this sermon is for so-and-so. They really need to hear this," you're the problem. okay? I only say that about a few lessons, but this is one of those lessons. If you think this is meant for somebody that isn't you, you're the problem and you're the reason I'm preaching this, okay? So with that, I bring up perspective that we understand everything by comparison to show, and I kept saying the word limited human being, right? Why? Because God does not need comparison. This is one of those times that I wish I had a marker board up here because I do better with marker boards than trying to pre-write out notes. But how many of you guys remember enough about high school or college math to know what an absolute value is? The high school and college kids. All right. So an absolute value is essentially, we use it a lot in algebra, but if you see a number with two brackets on the side, it's essentially saying the absolute value. And essentially all that does is remove an integer. So if it's -4, the absolute value of -4 is 4. Basically, if you write out numbers on a line, how far away is this number from 0? And an absolute value, it doesn't care if it's to the left of 0 or the right. It's still that value. And this is how God perceives things. Our value is our value. So it doesn't matter if you're putting an addition sign or a subtraction sign in front of it. It doesn't change the value of it. God doesn't need comparison because He is everything. He is everywhere. He knows everything. There is no need for comparison for somebody that does not need to observe things through the lens of time. Does that make sense to everybody? So, the way that this works, the reason that this is actually important is because we need to understand our limitations, that we are going to assess everything in our world through comparison, and also understand that that is not how God sees the world. When we do those two things, it allows us to have the only godly option we have, which is to compare everything to 0, to God. If we make God that baseline, if we make God that standard, and we compare everything to Him, that is the only godly option we have for comparison. It's not perfect, but it's the best we can do in our current form. Here's the other thing about humility is it's serving. It is serving to a point of self-sacrifice. Now, the reason that that's also important is because if I'm comparing everything to God, well, I would say, Brother Dave, you're not measuring up. I don't know if you were prepared to hear that this morning or not, but I regret to inform you, you are not making that cut. All right? But here's the thing, if that's my end goal, then I leave Him with that. And what's He supposed to do with that? I mean, really, what benefit have I just given to Him? Nothing. I haven't even told Him anything He didn't already know. Right? But if I'm being humble in its truest sense, then my goal is to glorify Him towards the Father, right? And in doing so, that is one way we glorify God, actually, to lift up His own creation, that which He glorified, we also glorify. So if I bring light to Dave, if my intention is to lift him up and to humble myself, make myself less than, then it changes how I talk to him. And that's everything. And we talked about this on Saturday. Far too often we make excuses for ourselves and we talk to people however we want and say, well, but it's the truth. I spoke the truth in love. Well, no, you didn't. You spoke the truth out of self-service. You spoke the truth so that you could hear yourself speak the truth. And you didn't particularly care how that other person was taking it. You didn't care how that other person was going to feel. You didn't care if that person was even going to respond properly to what you said. The fact that you said it in a way that put their walls up and made them defensive suggests that love had nothing to do with it. So now all of a sudden, instead of saying, Dave, I'm sorry to tell you, but you are not making the cut of comparing to God. If there was an infinity on a timeline, which there's not, you would definitely be there, right? Instead, now I'm coming to Dave and saying, hey, Dave, I noticed that you didn't seem excited to be here, and I'm worried that you're struggling with something in life. Can you talk to me about that? What can we do to help that out? Now, here's the thing. Either way, right? He should be joyful. The Bible tells us to be joyful. I could tell you that you're not being godly because you're not being joyful. You all look miserable to be looking at me right now, right? But what good does that do you? Now, on the other hand, if I show concern, I say, what's going on? What can I do to make this better? Those are very different statements with very different reactions, even if they came from the same place of comparison. Humility requires that we are coming at it from a point of serving another. And it's not up to you to decide how somebody needs to be served. It's actually a really powerful point that I think more people need to understand. It's not my place to tell someone else what they need from me. I don't care if you're 180 years old and have seen everything in your life. That is not our place. It is wrong and arrogant for me to say, I know what you need from me. Or to say, no, you don't need that from me. Now, I can suggest things that maybe you haven't thought of, but at the end of the day, that person is the one that has to decide what they need and how they need to be addressed. It's similar in a lot of ways to how we sorry, my brain just shut off for like a split second there. when we're dealing with offended. That was my next point. I had to find it there. We also talked about one of the other ways that we can measure our humility and pride is how offended are you? It's a really good guideline, actually. See, when we're offended by something, it is essentially saying that thing is not measuring up to our standard. So one has to ask, what's the standard that you're measuring something to that you have a right to be offended? Fact is, this is obviously one of those lessons I preach and don't practice as much as I should, right? I get just as offended as anybody. But I think the first step in us growing in our walk with God is acknowledging the parts that we're not doing well at, right? And there is more times than I count where I have been deeply offended by something, only to later realize it was because I had a position of arrogance to begin with. I am offended because you told me I was less than I thought I was. But why did I think so highly of myself that you could bring me down? Let's talk about the results of all of this. When we make ourselves humble, right? When we bring ourselves beneath someone else, we spend our energy serving another, right? It actually frees them up. The energy that they would have had to spend taking care of the things you're looking out for can be spent elsewhere. This is a very important understanding to come to because it impacts a lot of how we operate as a community and as Christians. So if I look out for your needs, that means you don't have to. Now, the idea here in a healthy relationship is that person is going to turn around and look after my needs. And in doing so, we fulfill one another. This is actually how Christians are supposed to operate. When somebody comes before us with a need, we seek to fill those needs with the wholehearted belief that later on, if we have a need, our brothers and sisters are going to be there. And when we can rely on that, when we trust in that, oh man, it's so much easier to keep working. It's so much easier to keep going. When I know that if life happens and the worst happens and I lose everything, or bills come in that I wasn't expecting, or I have some natural disaster, whatever, if some catastrophe uproots my life, if I know that if that were to happen, I have an entire body of believers that would support me and carry me through that struggle. What does that mean? That means I don't have to spend so much time safeguarding it. I don't have to spend all of my money and time hiding away every financial dollar I have for a rainy day, because I don't have to worry about the rainy days. I have family that's going to look after me in the rainy days. So what does that mean? That means that right now I can use that resource to look after somebody else who's going through a rainy day. That's community. That is the community that God originally intended for this church. But you see what happens in the opposite, right? And we say, I got to look after myself, and so I'm going to hoard this resource away. I'm going to look after myself. I'm going to worry about myself. And only when I have an abundance, when I have what I think I need, and I have an abundance, then I'll start giving out. I'll start helping. Right? Because then I'll have more than what I need, and I'm still taken care of. Here's the problem. You never have enough to feel secure. Ever. I have lived life through plenty and through poverty, and I can tell you safely, you will never be rich enough to feel secure. And do you know why that is? Because financial security is an illusion. It's a complete myth. The fact is, we have business owners who put millions of dollars, some of them tens of millions of dollars, into a bank, and then woke up one day and realized not only were they broke, they couldn't even get insurance for the money they lost. So, do you think that $10 million would make you feel secure? Because I can promise you that those millionaires who aren't millionaires anymore would tell you that it doesn't make you secure. So you see but the problem is, right, I spend all of my time trying to make sure that I'm secured, looking after my needs first, but that never ends. And that means that person has to look after their needs, which means they can't look after somebody else's. And it's this big domino effect where we all end up in the same self-serving, greedy position that we originally were in. We've mentioned something like this before, but why are you here? Seriously, why did you come to church today? To glorify God? I'm going to tell you something I'm not supposed to say at the pulpit, but you don't have to be at church to glorify God. Did you come to sing songs? You don't have to be at church to sing songs. You didn't have to come here this morning to do that. You didn't have to come here to pray. You didn't even have to come here to study God's word. Believe it or not, every one of you is qualified of doing exactly what I'm doing right now, which is studying and saying what I study. Every one of you is capable of doing that study. So why are you here? What was your reason for coming? Most people never get out of the rut, never get out of the mindset of coming to church for what they want. And what this ends up with is congregation members who are never satisfied because there's always something more they could be getting. The preacher could always do just a little bit better. The elders could always pay just a little bit more attention. The members could sing just a little bit better. There is always something to improve on, and so I'm never satisfied because my primary purpose for being here is to satisfy myself. It's pretty drear. It's pretty depressing mindset to have. But that is where a huge portion of Christians end up. Lord knows I was that way for several years. Even as a new preacher, I would go and preach with the thoughts of what I was getting out of it. But I can tell you that it leaves you drained. It leaves you really drained when all you have is criticism for everything. What I have found in my experience, and maybe some of you disagree with that, and that's fine, but what I have found in my experience is church is a lot easier to be and to do when I don't have to worry about what I'm getting out of it. Is God happy with what I've done today? That's important. Something worth for me to consider. With how I talk to people, is he happy with the lesson that I planned and how I presented it? Is he happy with how people responded to it? Is he happy with what I've done today? And two, are people getting something from me being here? Because if no one gets anything, if no one is better off for me being here, what would be the point of me being here? I mean, really, and that's not even just because I'm up here preaching. I'm saying for every one of you, if no one is better off for your being present, there's not much of a reason for you to be present. And maybe that's just my isolationist side coming out because, in my opinion, I get more from being alone half the time than I do with people. So for me, people is draining. It takes energy from me. It takes effort. So obviously, I'm not being around people for my sake. But if no one's benefiting, then what's the point? And I can tell you that while that adds a lot of weight and responsibility to everything we do when we assemble, I can tell you that it lets you leave much happier, much more satisfied. And the kingdom benefits for that mentality because now, instead of worrying about, well, somebody didn't talk to me a certain way, or, no, I came in, nobody greeted me, or, no one invited me to sit next to them during service, or all of this stuff, right? Instead, I'm doing that. Instead, I'm going and greeting people. I'm going and inviting people to sit next to me. I'm involving myself in service, and I'm doing those things because I'm now primarily concerned with what everyone else is getting. That's how glorify and humility operate on a practical level. Now, the problem is, what I've explained to you is essentially God's perfect system. And we all know how great we are at upkeeping and maintaining perfect systems. If you want proof of that, just look around at your life. I'm sure you can come up with a dozen examples of perfect systems that work perfectly. So the problem in this plan, in this system, the wrench that gets thrown in, is when somebody comes with that mentality. And they give, and they give, and they give, and they're trying to glorify everyone else. They're trying to glorify God. They're making themselves humble. and everyone else is okay accepting it. Well, what that means is instead of lifting that person up with you, we're just going to step on their shoulders because they offered. And there is more than enough people in the world that are more than happy to take advantage of people because they know they can. Understand, God will glorify that person beyond any height you could ever imagine on the final day, because we were happy allowing themselves to be humbled beyond anything we ever acquired. The interesting thing is, when we're talking about an absolute value perspective, what that means is the lower you get, the more you need to be lifted up to reach zero again. Think about this. If I make myself a negative 15 so that I can make you a negative 14, that means God actually glorifies me more and increases me more to get me to the same place he gets you. That's what the Bible is talking about when it talks about God glorifying us on the given day. It's not that some of us will be elevated above other people, but those of us who are most humble will be lifted up more to get to the same place. But here's the thing, if you've made yourself zero by allowing everyone else to be humble, where are you going to be lifted to? What's even scarier is the thought that a lot of people in this world would make themselves a positive integer. So all these negative 15s, negative 14s, they're being lifted all the way to zero. What do you think happens to the person who's a 15? They still got to go to zero, right? So I'm trying to give you this perspective so that you can understand the relationship between pride, between glory, between humility, and between ourselves and one another. We do not live in this capsule where we can obey God and interact with God separated from everyone around us. How we interact with each other is actually very, very important and influential on our relationship with God. Be something like this. If one of you came to my house and started being disrespectful to, we'll say, Eden, which I don't know what kind of monster you are to do something like that, but we'll just say you do. I'm not just offended for her sake. That's a disrespect to me. There is no difference. You cannot wrong my daughter without wronging me directly. And if anyone who's been any kind of parent will understand immediately what I'm talking about. There is no way to separate those two. You cannot bring negative impact or harm to my child and not have it be done directly to me. An attack on my home is an attack on me. There is no difference. This isn't about retaliation. You have attacked me. To me, there isn't three people in my home. There is one entity in my home. There is one family. And you can't attack a part of that family without the family having been attacked. Now, the reason I put this forward to you is because this is essentially what it means to be the creator of something. Right? Honestly, it's very strange for me to say, but parenting is about as close as I think any person can come to even understanding God. Because it's that is the moment in which we begin to understand what it means to create something and the impact that process has on you. Now, I am, as a limited human being, I even observe my daughter through comparison. And for that reason, at times, even in my eyes, her value falls shorter than it should. I know I'm not supposed to admit that as a dad, right? But the fact is, I am not perfect in how I see the world. So God, having an absolute perspective, nothing can influence him one way or the other as far as how he values something. My question to you is, if I feel that way about my family, if I feel that way about my child, how do you think God feels about it? I mean, seriously, if he knits each one of us together, if he is intimately involved in our creation and birth, how does God react when we start humiliating people and forcing them down to lift us up? I bring this up because I'm trying to show you that you cannot separate how we interact with one another and how we interact with God. They are inextricably and intimately tied together. Now, I know this has already been a longer lesson. I promise I'm only going to make one more point, and then we'll be done for the day. I can make a part 2 if the elders decide that there's more to be said. Proverbs 15:33 tells us, "The fear of the Lord teaches a man wisdom, and humility comes before honor." When we humble ourselves and when we interact with one another through humility, we actually have a lot of power and influence over them spiritually. We have the power to make a massive impact on their eternity. And if I tell you that you're not measuring up, if all of my interactions with you show you that you are not measuring up to the standard, that's what hopelessness does to someone. If I can't measure up, if there's no hope for me, then I'm just going to reject it. Might as well, right? When we approach somebody with humility, and when we glorify others, and we say, and we show them, I'm trying to lift you up to the standard by which I compare the world to, and their life is improved because we've done that, they're going to be a lot more interested in just how far that goes. Man, if you've improved my life this much, and you're still going, what's the standard? Where are you trying to get? Because if my life's been improved, I'm going to pursue that, right? I am not a moderate person by nature. If some is good, more is better. And if you do something that's going to improve my life, I want more of that. And I think the vast majority of humanity operates that way. So, my concluding point here is, humility is not just something that's important because God tells us to do it. Now, that should be enough for us. But sometimes it's easier to understand something when we understand its interactions with the world around us and the impact it has. By understanding how humility affects us and how it affects other people, we can actually assess our humility a little bit better. But humility is important because nothing at all is ever asked of us that Jesus did not provide us an example for. We know what it means to humble ourselves because Jesus Christ showed us what humility looks like. We know what it means and looks like to glorify God through the way we live because Jesus Christ came and showed us first-hand perspective what it looks like to live in a way that glorifies God. We know how to love one another because Jesus Christ came and first-person perspective showed us what it looks like to live a life of love. And that verse that we brought up so long ago and struggled with, the idea that we are to love one another to the point of being willing to give up our lives. As hard as that may seem to understand, we can in fact understand it because Jesus Christ came and first-person perspective showed us what it meant to give his life up for us. For the sake of shining a light on us, of lifting us up to that standard. He died for us so that we wouldn't be humiliated. This morning we want to offer you, as we do every time we gather, a time for you to express needs, to make sure that you're fulfilled in all of this. And so this morning, if you have need of prayer, or if you have need of making confession, or if you have need of being reconciled, or if you have need of forgiveness of sins, if you seek to repent and turn towards God and to experience death, burial, and resurrection through the waters of baptism, whatever your needs are this morning, we ask that you bring them forward and make them known so we can help you see them met as we stand and sing.